Hello everyone, and welcome to the Centre of World Environmental History's final event as part of Climate Justice Week at the University of Sussex. We will be having two talks about deforestation, mining and climate change in Jharkand and Odisha. We will begin with a talk from our artist in residence and the convener of our Academia and Activism network, Zuky Serper.
At least the Activist in Academia Forum is dealing with the impact of mining on people and nature, mainly working in India. That these two case studies that we're going to talk today about, the Saranda Forest, that is very large forest in Jharkand, and the Niyamgiri Hills or the Niyamgiri range that I'm going to talk about now. I'm going to share screen. Let's first open my PowerPoint properly, and then I'll share the screen with you. Let's see how it works. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, it may be that some of the photographs will be needed to, you'll need to adjust your pane of participants so you can see the whole photograph. But basically, this is a photograph taken in 2004 of the Niyamgiri Hills in the state of Odisha in the eastern part of India, southeast part of India. The interest was personal to start with. Felix was living there and invited us to visit after a mining company called Sterlite that turned out to be owned by Vedanta, bought the area, or got the lease on mining the area, bauxite from this area. And then the whole narrative of the Niyamgiri for us started. Now you can see how lush the forest is, and it's due to the fact that the soil and the rock underneath is full of rainwater that are kept in the bauxite during the dry season. So the bauxite is very high quality. About 60% of India's reserves are in Odisha. So target for mining companies. Now, let's see, why is it not? So I'm finding it difficult to see why is the control not working. Yeah, okay. Now, back in 2004, when we visited, the company got the lease, but didn't get permission to mine the Niyamgiri. So it got the lease to build a refinery, a giant refinery of 1 megaton alumina per year, but it didn't get any permissions to do anything else. But started to build roads, build railway, and we took this photograph in one of our journeys to show how the intrusion into this pristine environment looks like. So this is 2004. 2003, they started to build a refinery, still no clearances to cut down any tree, even though they have cut by then nearly 60 acres of forest to build this refinery. And it's quite a historic photograph because there are 2 white chimneys that you can see, and they were permitted. The third chimney was built without permission to extend the refinery for 6 megatons per year, which means they didn't get the clearances, but they still build it. And it's like a monument for basically breaching the legal procedures. They also built this conveyor belt that supposedly goes up to the mountain to deliver bauxite mined on the mountain, on the Niyamgiri, down to the refinery at the bottom in Lanjigar. However, they didn't get the mining permission, they didn't get the environmental clearances, and it's like, again, like a dead monument. This dead dinosaur of a conveyor belt is just there. This is a photograph from 2009. It looks a bit more dilapidated now. This is another site in Baplamali, in Panchpatmali, another site of bauxite mining. Just to give you an illustration, what does it mean that you mine a mountain covered, a bauxite mountain covered with jungle? So on the top right, you can see the strip clearance of topsoil and this big lorry, this track that can carry 1 ton of bauxite, takes the mined bauxite into this conveyor belt. That's how a conveyor belt looks like when it delivers the crushed bauxite into further crushing down into that factory. And in the landscape, on the left-hand side, you can see the landscape that is completely disfigured by this conveyor belt, cutting down all the trees that are standing in its way. So this is more an illustration of what would have happened in the Niyamgiri if we had the company having its way. So this is a talk about mining, it's a talk about deforestation, it's a talk about the link between deforestation and climate change that put so well in Richard Grove's book, Green Imperialism. Richard Grove, who started the Center for World Environmental History and is sadly late Richard Grove, who passed away at the end of last year. And the last bit will be GIS, Geographic Information Systems, or Geographic Information Science, which is a way of dealing with satellite images and processing them to map information visually. So this is what I'm gonna try to show today, as well as talk a little bit about the campaign that we were doing with regard to Vedanta. So you got 3 images here. The bottom left shows you a little map of India with black dot. This is Odisha. So since 2009, it's Odisha. Then a map of Odisha and the 2 districts, Kalahandi and Rayagada, that the Niyamgiri Hills fall just on the seam between them. We got a satellite image that I produced out of, I think it's 2020, I can't see the top, either 20 or 21. So basically the satellite sends those images down to stations on Earth, and it is possible to put the 3 bands of the red, green, and blue and produce what is called a true color image of the area you're looking at. So this is the Niyamgiri Hills. It looks like a mango. And this is where the refinery is. So the Niyamgiri Hills and Lanjigar, the village is here. The refinery is this red dot. And this is an image from Google Earth that I'm going to show later, a close-up, that shows the site now the way it looks online. You can just go to Google Earth and find it online. This is how a close-up of how it looks. This is a close-up of that refinery. So all the, whatever it takes to refine bauxite into alumina, and all the debris, the tailing ponds, the ash ponds, everything that is the byproduct of production of alumina, that is 1 stage before aluminium. You can see all these names. They're little villages. Some of them were swallowed by this giant perimeter of a refinery. And we're going to get to the human aspect of what does it mean to live there. This is a very brave woman called Tula Day, and she's been living with her family in the perimeter within the compound of this aluminium refinery, and I'll just read to you what she is telling in a testimony. I'm just trying to get to the text, full text. I have no idea why they arrested my husband. The police and lawyers do not give us any details. False charges. Sorry, I just can't see it. False charges must have been framed against my husband. They are constantly trying to intimidate and harass us. Whenever we raise our voice in protest, they frame some charge and arrest a family member. Our family's livelihood has been completely destroyed. Vedanta has ruined our lives ever since it came here. Fear and injustice is all we have known since then. So this is a testimony in an article. So this family has to move finally from that location. So imagine, what does it mean to live within these perimeters? The dust, the lung disease that you would get, the skin rashes, the dry, no drink, the desiccation of the area, no drinking water. This is the northern bit of the Niyamgiri Hills. The refinery is just north of it. And this is, this is Lanjiga, the village. Now, I didn't say anything about the phases of the acquisition of land started in 2003. There were probably, there are some reports about 12, 13 villages that were sitting on site of the refinery. They were told, served notice and told to leave. Those who accepted the compensation got immediately moved to this new kind of compound that was built for them, the Vedanta Nagar, this village that was concrete buildings to house those people that used to live on the land. Others that didn't move fought for their rights, didn't really get anything. It's quite depressing really picture to see. It's like a moonscape, very, very arid and desolate. So this started in 2003. The Vedanta started to build a refinery then. It took them about 5 to 6 years to get to full capacity production. So by 2009, we can see the refinery working in full blast, the company trying to encroach the Niyamgiri Hills, big fight with the local people, harassment of any attempt to resist that fate. And in the course of this struggle, what is so interesting is there's a very strong people's movement that was growing up from the ground, supported by different political groupings and supported by international solidarity of many groups. And before there was Foil Vedanta, there were the Friends of Odisha that Felix and Samarendra helped establish and were leading before 2010. In 2010, Foil Vedanta came into existence as a group that was actually and intentionally making the links between where the company Vedanta was based, which was London, and it was traded in the London Stock Market Exchange, and the site of impact, the impactful site of Niyamgiri and Lanjiga. So really inspiring case that took quite a few years, but eventually the story was a story of victory when in 2013, the Supreme Court of India, under pressure of local people, the local movement, political parties, and international organizations, it became an international case that many groups were fighting for, including protest in front of the AGM of the company every year in London, etc., etc. Eventually, in 2013, the referendum rejected the company's attempts to mine the Niyamgiri, probably forever. So very inspiring an ecological conflict that ended up in victory. What do we see in this picture? This is called a false color image. Again, a satellite image, and probably I believe that this is the first image ever produced of the Niyamgiri Hills. So this is the area of the Niyamgiri Hills. You can see the date here. So the letters indicate that this is a Landsat 1 image. So the satellite called Landsat. It's the earliest satellite, and the earliest images in the world of satellites are from 1972. So this is the first image that was probably produced for Niyamgiri. And I've just made it 2 or 3 months ago. And I felt that I did a historical kind of act, producing the first satellite image of the Niyamgiri. It's called false color because it puts together short wave infrared, red, and green channels put together, layered together, sandwiched together. You could produce those images that then tell you a lot about, for instance, the red colors that are very sensitive to vegetation. So anything red indicates healthy vegetation. This is that image, but here I bring it for the historical kind of value of the first image produced out of satellites. This is a bit more scientific, I would say, image. But maybe before I do that, shall we have a little break for questions, because I feel that I said quite a lot and maybe people would like to ask some questions. So I'll see if I can, how do I stop my sharing? Okay.
Zuky, I think you should carry on. We're all engrossed in your presentation. Okay. Please carry on.
Okay. Does everyone else feel the same?
Yeah, I think if you have questions that come to you during the course, just put them in the chat and then we'll get to them in due course.
Okay, so please look at the chat because I'm very bad at reading and talking. Okay, so this is back to the GIS element. Apart from it being very colorful, I'll explain exactly what we see here. So on the bottom left, we can see the same satellite image that I showed in the beginning of the...
You have to share your screen again.
Oh, sorry. I thought I'm sharing it. Hang on. I'll get back to sharing. Which one is this? Okay. So let me just get back to PowerPoint. Okay. So what we see in those 4 images, we see the same satellite image, just to give you the impression of the Niyamgiri as it would have looked like in a true color image on the bottom left. Now the interesting thing is, not this one. This is called DEM. It's a digital elevation model, which is an interpretation of the curvature of the Earth into colors. So again, you see the Niyamgiri Hills, and every color indicates a certain height. You can see that the projection system is degrees. And the scale, you can see that the scale here is 50 kilometers wide of this tile. It's called, this tile. The Niyamgiri is approximately 380 square kilometers by a rough measuring that I just did before the talk now. So you see here basically the layout of the terrain. What is interesting is when you look at the map of precipitation. So this is an image that shows us high precipitation in dark blue and low participation in light blue or white. And the interesting thing for me, at least, that visually you can really see the Niyamgiri Hills. So there's no underlying map here. There's only amount of precipitation of rainfall in September on a certain point. And these points put together create a map, and the map creates a map that is very similar to the layout of the Niyamgiri. The same happens with temperatures. This is a temperature interpretation of a satellite image. And again, we can see that the cool temperatures in blue and green are on the Niyamgiri. It gets really, really hot as you go to these bare soil areas. This is the area of the refinery. I'll look at it more in detail later, but it's just fascinating that visually you can really see the impact of a forested terrain and the link between forest and deforestation, climate change and desiccation. I think it's just fascinating. It's very visual, it's very intuitive to see. Now, this is an old map. It's interesting that the American Army produced those maps. This is a 1955, the earliest map that I could find of the area. This is, again, the Niyamgiri is here. You can see that all the green are forests. So it has been a much more forested area in probably the 1930s when the actual drawings were made, or in the 1950s when the map came out, than today. So we're talking about the Niyamgiri here, and again, the refinery area here. You can maybe just about read Lanjiga in this, where the arrow is pointing, Lanjiga. So this is really for illustration only. I want to show you here, just because I find it an interesting way of talking about mapping, the way that we can show an animation of temperature over time. So just follow this, this is February, March, April, May, getting hotter, June, monsoon season, July, August, September, and that's it. So it's 5 hottest months from sorry.
Sorry, Zuky, we can't see it.
Oh, sorry. So I have to share it again.
Well, you're sharing, but we can't see the animation, or I can't at least.
Oh,
I don't know about others.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We can't either.
Okay, well, maybe we do it later in the talk. It's just a nice way of presenting again the animation, the temperature information as an animation. So am I sharing with you? Can you see that?
Yes, can see your screen.
Okay, so just imagine you saw an animation of temperatures. Now there's another quite common index called NDVI, Normalized Something Vegetation Index. I can't remember what the D stands for. NDVI is quite a common index, and usually you see maps in pink and in green, where green indicates very healthy vegetation and pink is usually urban areas or bare soil. So the reflection of those surfaces, bare soil, reflect a lot of radiation back into the sensor, and it is read as very low value in NDVI. NDVI usually is using the band 3 and band 4, so the red and the infrared bands that are most sensitive to green vegetation. They appear in combination, they appear green on this map. The pink is the less sensitive areas for infrared and red, and you can see them pink here. It is possible also, of course, to quantify, so I can really, in some point, make statistical analysis with numbers of what exactly is the difference, the change between 1973, the top left, 2003, top right, and sorry, the title is not right, but the bottom one is from 2020. You can see that back in January, so I chosen images from January with the assumption that in January we get, after the monsoon and in the winter, we get good vegetation indexes. And it is clear of clouds, very good indication to choose images for analysis. So this image from 1973 shows the Niyamgiri and its environs very, very green, very high NDVI value. Jumping 30 years later, January 2003, just before Vedanta started to build its refinery in the north of the Niyamgiri here, you can see that there's much less green vegetation, and that the non-vegetative area, the bare soil and the little urban spaces that they are there, reflect light that becomes, that is visualized as pink here, pink and white. Now, it doesn't mean that this is the ultimate fact. It could be that on the day that the photograph, the image was taken, there was a little bit more reflection or less reflection. So it is not, it's as best as we can get out of the satellite, let's say. Let's put it like this. Now we move to the 2020 image at the bottom left, and you can see that, again, we got quite good coverage of vegetation on the Niyamgiri hills and everything else that is green. But you can really see the refinery here. Can you see where the arrow is pointing, these white places here? This is where the refinery is. So very low values of NDVI, meaning that this area has gone through desiccation and deforestation. So those 58 acres of trees that were on the compound of the refinery were probably impacting the NDVI value that we read here. Now, there is a precipitation video here, and I don't know if I'll be able to show you, so let's just move on. We can get back to it later. Now, I'm getting to a different part of the talk, which is a bit more philosophical and a little bit more to do with my philosophical, artistic kind of background. And I want to bring up Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, a book from 1964 that had great influence on the New Left in the 1960s. And in this book, he's talking about many, many things, but one sentence that really kind of stayed with me is the irrationality of the rational. So our world of exploiting nature for our livelihood is all very rational. But the overall picture is completely irrational in terms of how much do we need to produce, how do we do it, what is the impact of our production on not on us in the market and on them. And I'm saying them, meaning people that are living in those places, these unfortunate people that are living in those places where Western companies are mining and buying their commodities. So very, very influential book on me. And when I'm talking about irrationality, I really like this image because it visualizes the complete nonsensical element of mining. Now, this is a warehouse in Detroit. It used to be owned by Goldman Sachs until 2013. And it used to store those aluminum ingots. So basically, after everything you saw in Niyamgiri, the bauxite from there, from Jamaica, in the cockpit country, from Guyana, from anywhere in the world, after smelting it in Iceland and collapsing its economy, after polluting everywhere on Earth with aluminum production, it ends up in this warehouse near Detroit, owned by a big financial entity. And all it does is move from one warehouse to another, because this is how they make their money. And if this is irrational, I mean, if this is rational, this is irrationalism in its top, I would say, for me. Now, opposite it, I would like to argue and tell a narrative of resistance, of ecological conflict that is based on bringing justice to these people and stopping this insane drive to mine a pristine forest. Now, Felix is here. He can talk much better than me about the Dongria Khons, a tribal people group that has few communities, few villages on the Niyamgiri Hills, and effectively protect the hills from dying, basically. And they see the hills as their mother and father. I'm showing these orange banners because the campaign group Foil Vedanta that I was helping start and work was quite instrumental in making this link between London, the base of the company, the headquarters, the AGM, the financial support from the London Stock Market Exchange, former ambassadors to India sitting on the board of directors, and so on and so forth. And a people's movement that is stopping that madness from happening. So I think it's a very, very nice visual kind of representation of London on the right-hand side, bottom, and then the same banner being brought to India to take part in the Padayatra, in the walk, 7 days walk, to announce the objection to Vedanta's intentions in the referendum and eventually winning the referendum. And look how amazing this woman, this young woman in the front of the march with her mobile phone. She's very self-conscious, aware, politically aware. It's just an amazing, amazing image. I want to read here from, I think, a seminal book that Felix Padel and Samarendra Das wrote in 2010. And I'm reading from the second edition that Samarendra Das then edited, and it's here for you all to see. And I'm just going to read this paragraph about globalization. It's about the use of which terminology could be used to describe the movement. Globalization and anti-globalizations are also terms that obscure more than they reveal. We are globalizing by writing this book and calling for solidarity amongst India's Dalits, Bhujans, and Adivasi communities. The enemy is capitalism, this irrationalism, yes, of the rational. The insane system of perpetual growth and value money and profit above people or nature. So I think it really sums it, for me, sums it all. I want to talk about ecological conflicts. Back in 2004, this person on the left, called Joan Martinez Allier, traveled and we met together to join a convoy that went to this amazing commemoration event, very important event of killing of 3 tribal people by police in 2000 in a conflict about mining in the area, in Odisha. And we traveled there. We were stopped on the way. Anyway, it was a long story. I'm not going to tell it. And it was an amazing kind of solidarity of two, I would say, sages of scholarship. The interesting thing that here I want to bring is that Joan came and developed this notion of ecological conflict, and in his book Environmentalism of the Poor. And he said that back at that time, he emailed me, I invited him to this talk, and he emailed me and said, back at that time, I didn't even know what Pirangi or Pirangi means. It means foreigner. So we were Pirangi. So the ecological conflicts happen on the ground in Niyamgiri. Back in London, in the AGM, protest takes a direct action form, and this was in the Guardian, in the Guardian newspaper. This is images from 2012. In 2014, we had, and here I'm coming back to the activist nature of the Center for World Environmental History. We gathered quite a substantial number of activists and scholars, and both, for a forum. And you can see Felix here, you can see Joan and other people. I don't want to bore you. To talk about, to make the link between different sides of environmental ecological conflicts. We had India, we had Africa in Zambia, we had Ecuador, the Intag and the Yasuni Park, and all these areas are still case studies that we are dealing with. And Vinita is going to talk about Jharkand that came a little bit later. And today we heard about Manipur from a scholar that wrote a new book about it. Sikoka is the current leader of the Niyamgiri Suraksha Samiti, NSS, the people's movement in Niyamgiri. He's a tribal person. You can see the axe on his shoulder. He's an amazing and very brave person. I don't know if you want to hear about my art. I can talk about it later. And I want to end, if people will be interested, I want to end with Joan's book, because I feel that there's a lot of relevance to us as academics, as scholars. And he says about his intentions. I'm interested in reflective activism and participatory research in ecological conflicts, whether this helps academic advancement or not, whether it fits into any academic discipline or not. We are witnessing the growth of a worldwide movement for environmental justice, which might become a powerful factor in forcing the economy into ecological adjustment and social justice. I'm glad to be part of this movement. So I don't know, I'm also glad to be part of this movement, and I'll always be. And if you want to be, today at 4, there is a launch of climate action as an attempt to create a global platform for the environmental movement starting now. So I think that this is me for today. I'll see if I can get myself back to you. How do I stop sharing?
I think it's at the top of the screen.
Yeah, but have I stopped sharing?
No, you haven't.
Stop sharing. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Zuky. So before we have questions, we're going to have another talk from Vinita. So Vinita Damodaran is the director of the Center of World Environment History, and she's a professor of South Asian history who has worked extensively on the environmental history of India and the Indian Ocean world. So Vinita.
So thank you, Mike, and thank you, Zuky, for that excellent talk. So I'm an environmental historian, and I can only marvel at Zuky's amazing sort of display of GIS imagery. But I just wanted to contextualize something which Zuky said in terms of its long-term historical context, looking at a neighboring area of Jharkand with very similar sort of issues. And Zuky started off his talk talking about the red dust. And I'll start with a quote of a mining area where, of course, I've also traveled quite extensively to some of these areas. And I was struck by the presence of, rather like Zuky was, by the presence of red oxide dust everywhere. And there was a newspaper report, I think, that put it brilliantly, which said that mine areas often have a monochromatic appearance. Coal mining areas are depressingly black. Iron ore towns are red. Ochre lends a yellow color, and limestone makes everything chalky white. Fine particles of the ore spread as a uniform layer of dust on every available surface in these areas. The pervasiveness of dust is the strongest indication that mining is not a benign activity. Unless carefully planned, it can barren the land, pollute water, denude forests, defile the air, and degrade the quality of life for the people who live and work in this vicinity. Modern technology has enormously magnified our ability to extract minerals. In the process, it has also gravely threatened human lives and the environment. So the area where I'm going to talk about is where I was traveling in is Saranda and the forests of Jharkand. So I'll just title show you the title. If everyone can see that. Yeah, okay, right. I'm just going to, sorry, current slide. So I'm going to contextualize, as I said, what Zuky has just said within the long-term historical context of Eastern India and its forests and communities. So what are the main themes of what I'm going to be talking about today? Sorry. I'm going to shift that slightly. Sorry, I'm just reducing that. So if you look at the long-term history of the region, which is what I'm interested in and what I worked on, it's what I'll be trying to do in this short presentation. I have about 20-25 minutes, is to look at the way in which history has hitherto been understood, and the way in which the unnatural history of history has pervaded our understanding, and how when you bring history back into the center of our understanding of humans and their lived environment, it's not war that predominates. All my students are interested in writing about the Second World War and so on. It's the way in which we have changed the environment. And now with the debates on the Anthropocene, this becomes even more important to understand. And as an environmental historian, I would like to take the turf back from these scientists who are talking about, or geologists who talk about it from a very scientific point of view, to try to understand how our interactions with the environment has been documented in the historical record. So looking at, for example, and Zuky also talked about the way in which capitalism and colonialism have impacted on nature in the longue durée. And in this context, looking at the history of forest reserves in the plateau region of Chotanagpur, now part of Jharkand, and honing down even more carefully, looking primarily at the biography of a forest, which currently occupies 860 square meters, primarily sal trees, which are Shorea robusta trees, one of the largest such forests in Asia. And one of the biographers of this forest, Gladsung Dungdung, in terms of its contemporary conflict, has called it the Amazon of India. So what is this discourse of the unending frontier that colonialism sort of heralds in the context of South Asia? So from the period of about 1670 to 1950, you get a pattern of ecological power relations emerging in which expanding European states under East India companies acquired a global reach over natural resources in terms of consumption and in terms of political and ecological control. And even before the advent of these large-scale European empires in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, you get a large-scale artificially caused environmental change in the Anthropocene, as we now know it, which was already transforming environments as a result of European maritime countries starting to exploit new kinds of natural resources. Sugar, of course, we know about, the way in which oceanic islands were colonized, the extinction of the dodo in Mauritius, the ways in which we harvest fish, furs in Canada, seals and whales, as we know. So John F. Richards, in a remarkable book called The Early Modern World, has talked about this relentless, unending resource frontier. So when we come to India, then again you can see this imagery of the frontier. And today in the Manipur talk, they were talking about new frontiers in the context of mining in India's northeast. So when we talk about the Eastern Indian frontier and how the British sort of engaged with this area, which Zuky was just talking about, in Chota Nagpur, the first entry of the British follows after the Battle of Plassey in 1765, and we see the emergence of the discourse of the frontier. You could see the creation of the Ramgarh Hill Tract in the 1780s, a huge district which include Hazaribagh, Palamu, Gaya, Munger, Manbhum, and Singhbhum. Some of it now in Bihar, other parts of it in Jharkand. So primarily populated by the Munda and Ho tribes, Adivasis now we call them. These were very recalcitrant groups who the British found very difficult to control. So between 1820 and 1831, you get the coal rebellions. The coal, of course, again, being a pejorative term for the dark peoples. So these rebellious tribes, the British sought to quell very determinedly in order to extract, as I said, both revenue and resources. And they started taxing these people. And you find in the historical record, these communities talking about hiding their plows so that the British could not tax every single plow that they found. So the Southwest Frontier Agency is established in 1833 with its headquarters at Lohardaga. And later on, you get these districts, Hazaribagh, Mangbhum, and later Singhbhum. Singhbhum is where Saranda Forest is, which were formed into separate districts. At about the turn of the 20th century, the population was about nearly 6 million. So when we take this longitudinal approach, you can map the history of the region in 3 phases. So 1803, when the East India Company arrives, to 1947, 1947 to 1991, and 1991 onwards, much of it, the post-1991 phase, Zuky has tried to talk about in the context of Orissa. So these are forests which are subject to relentless cutting in the 19th century as part of a sort of ecological control agenda of the EIC. And you get, for example, someone like William Schlick, the British were employing German foresters, who noted how some of these areas contained little forest by the 1890s. So the limits of cultivation seem to have been reached, and there was a very dramatic change in the environment by this period. So what Schlick is talking about is he means that there's little valuable forest, for there was still over 2,281 square miles of forest in Ranchi and in Hazaribagh. But it was subject to sort of relentless cutting, especially once railways were brought in the 1850s. The British also relentlessly culled game. So you get rewards in the late 19th century for 28 rupees for a tiger, 5 rupees for a leopard, 2 to 8 for a bear. So these animals were considered to be vermin. And you get very different ethics for, or the understanding of wildlife, which is very different to the way in which indigenous communities viewed animals. So you get a takeover of Adivasi lands on a massive scale. And suddenly you get the rise of famine. So the 1896, if you want to know when society sort of hits a tipping point, and as an environmental historian, we talk about tipping points. We are now, in the context of the Anthropocene, we are talking about a global sort of tipping point. So in this area, a local tipping point, you could say, was reached in 1897. And so hastily, then the British concoct some sort of resolution. They have some sort of protective legislation for these tribes. The Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act of 1908 and heralds a period of discourse of tribal protection. And this is, of course, followed by the idea of a regulatory regulatory and non-regulatory sort of districts, which heralds the Scheduled Areas and Tribes Act, which in 1947 marks off this area as something which needs to be protected from development, and local communities need to be protected against displacement. So when I talk about the way in which indigenous ideas were differed from the British, here we talk about the way in which these communities entered the forest. They're burning grass. Their hunting parties are. This is not, we are not romanticizing these communities. They are still culling the forest. They're still culling wild animals. And one of the colonial records by Tickell notes that from burning of the grass till the new crop becomes too high, that means between January and June, the whole tribe scour the jungles in large parties and at uncertain periods for wilder game, surrounding and driving to the center the deer and other animals. So they do hunt, but the hunting ethos is very different. This is hunting for food. This is the way in which the symbolism of the forest is very important for them. Very different from, say, the colonial hunt. And here's Lord Curzon, who was notorious for his partition of Bengal in 1906, but Curzon himself is quite an interesting character. Not only is he a hunter, he also heralds a period of reservation by setting up the Kaziranga game reserves later on. And he comes back to this country in the start of the 20th century and starts a national trust. So what the British are able to do in India, they're not able to do in this country, and they do it much later in Britain. But here is a very different valuing of the environment to the communities that we talked about. So the local forests then in Eastern India were very important to these communities precisely because of their food value. So not just because of their aesthetic value, but because of their food value. Another reporter, it was reported by another forest official, the settlement operations in Chotanagpur estate. He enumerated 21 species of seeds, 45 uncultivated, the fruits of 45 uncultivated trees, which were used as food, 34 trees, the leaves of which were used as vegetables, 18 species of edible roots. He also gave the names of 97 forest products used as medicines, 28 used as oil and gum, 17 used as dyes, 33 creepers or barks, and trees used as rope fiber. So the economic value of these jungles to these Adivasis is extremely interesting and important for us. But also these forests were important for their cultural and aesthetic values encompassed within hunting, fishing, and gathering activities. And the local the ethnographers of the time, I'm talking about the late 19th century, are very much talking about the way in which the trees are important for these communities. Among the Ho, for example, individual trees represented women, and Ho initiation ceremonies involved men making love, young boys making love to trees. So let us plant mango and palm trees, my brother. Let us enclose a tank, my brother, that we may be remembered. And on the top of the embankment under the kadum tree, may the sasum bird sing. So the songs that and the proverbs of the time, I think, are quite interesting again. And this idea of the sacred grove, an area of land with spiritual significance, where communities could not cut a single branch, is also quite widely prevalent at this time. That's an image of a sacred grove for you, where the spirits of the forest reside. And the local aesthetic values were celebrated through, by the Mundas, for example, the Singh Bonga, you have the worship of a rain god was also common among them and other tribes in Chotanagpur. More important, however, was the ritual significance, as I said, of the sacred grove. So the destruction of the forests in the 19th century was followed by forest reservation. So I mentioned the relentless cutting down of trees and the British then always, and this is the debate which Richard Grove has highlighted for us, the discourse of environmentalism, which emerges in the colonial context, not in the metropolitan center. So the chief object of reservation, again, is debated. Zuky talked about the drying up and desiccation. And some of the arguments that Richard highlights is what is the main reason for forest reservation at this time Was it revenue? Was it climate? Was it aesthetic? So here, Brandeis is talking about revenue. He's the German forester. Forest management in India has commenced to yield a steady and growing annual revenue to the state. This revenue might be larger if the forests were not managed with the chief objective of improving their condition. Hitherto, cuttings have been restricted. So there were multiple motives in protecting the forest, but certainly it was not to give access to indigenous communities. And early forestry motivations, if you look at Richard's work, the climate and environmental aspects of it in islands such as in Mauritius and St. Helena, he talked about the way in which early environmentalists in the 18th century legislated and theorized about deforestation, climate control, and pollution control, and fisheries. And the first forest acts were set up in 1791, you will be surprised to learn, in St. Vincent. And similar measures were passed in St. Helena as a result of El Nino drought. So the droughts were one thing that they worried about. The cutting down of trees, the British were really concerned would lead to climate change. So there was a climate element, a climatic environmentalism that may have resulted in these forest reserves. But colonial forestry in India, according to Ravi Rajan, drew heavily on German practices. So it was very much to do with scientific forestry. Indigenous trees were not really respected. You get teak planting on a massive scale. It was very modernist, drawing on ideas of improvement. Though, of course, deforestation, it was they realized would result in damaging reductions in rainfall, and increase in regional temperature, and the drying up of streams. And one group they were really talking about in negative terms was the indigenous communities, not their own practices of cutting down trees for commercial purposes, but the damage caused by shifting cultivation was what they highlighted in much of this, the blame game for the deforestation. So you then get an exclusionary forest system being set up by the British. 1/5 of India's landscape was preserved under these exclusionary forest system, one of the most largest systems in the world. And you could only get it in a colonial context. It shut out hunters and farmers from their traditional resources and has caused chronic conflict since its foundation. So the impact of this on communities was dramatic. You can see many of these communities, as I've said, had depended on these forests. In 1878, the Indian Forest Act was passed, extending policies regarding reserve forests and protected forests to all the provinces of British India. Every possible safeguard against infringements by private rights surrounded the first-class constitution of reserve forest. The second-class demarcation of protected forests, however, afforded less sufficient guarantees for stability and protection. There were also private forests leased from the political states. By 1898, 33,738 square miles of forest were closed to all animals. 28,146 square miles were closed to browsers throughout India. One of the most draconian, as I said, forest legislations. And the way in which it went was reserve protected. Village forests were where you could have your own forest. Protected forests were where some rights would accrue, and reserve forests were where no rights could accrue. So when we come to our Saranda forest then, by 1884-85, Choranagpur division was constituted, which embraced the whole of, this is the forest division, Singhbhum, Palamu, and Kodarma. And 306 square miles of Saranda were constituted under the reserve forest range by 1885, managed by 1 forest ranger, 3 forest guards, and 6 chowkidars. So as I said, these were spread over 700 hills, extremely beautiful, the largest forest in Asia, the Amazon of India. And here, in some senses, the protection was important. In Saranda, the reserves were situated entirely in the western third of the district, and the Kalan government estate, and formed a compact block bordered on the north by the belt of a cultivated country through which ran the Bengal-Nagpur railway that divided them from the reserves of the Parahat estate, where the 2 forested tracts met at Goalkera. In the south and southwest, the reserves are coterminous with the large tracts of forest in Gangpur, Bana, and Keonjhar, the native states or princely states. On the east were the protected forests and cultivated lands of Singhbhum. So this green and brown history of these areas, I think, are very important. Brown in the sense of agricultural history. and green in the sense of the forest histories. And neighboring Paraha to Saranda was a protected forest, but even there the British were cutting down on local rights, and you get the first rebellions. I'd mentioned the coal rebellions of the 1830s, but this is another major rebellion in the 1890s by Birsa Munda, where it was clearly linked to the way in which these jungles were protected against, so that indigenous communities could not have access to them. In the context of this rebellion, of course, Birsa Munda was then shot. So he was as I said, he's still remembered, and there's a whole cult following around Birsa Munda in the region today. But following the Birsa Munda rebellion, as I said, the discourse of tribal protection takes off, and the Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act, which prevents whatever limited lands are left to these communities, they are sort of protected against outsider interventions. Or, Zuky talked about the Firangi, but here they're called Dikus. Dikus are the foreigners. So when these forests then are protected, what sort of, as Shiva Ramakrishna notes in his amazing book called Modern Forest, working plans came to symbolize the confidence of the scientific forester. But visualizing a terrain where science could plan unimpeded, the manipulation of the forest compelled a more complete enumeration and disposal of local rights than might obscure the vision. So this whole idea of a working plan, I think when you look at these modern forestry, is quite important. It completely denies local rights. And here, as the working plan for Saranda was being outlined, you can see P.J. Phillips saying, the Saranda, the tract was very mountainous, the larger valleys being occupied by village lands, while the reserves covered the jumble of higher hills and smaller, higher lying valleys in Saranda. Villages were fewer and many large valleys were uncultivated and contained fine forest. In former times, this was not the case, but topographical maps of 60 years ago show quite a number of villages or old village sites in Saranda, whose names and sites have in most cases long been forgotten. So what does this mean? That means that all the villages in Saranda area had been sort of evicted, and the local communities, for example, in Saiba block, there were some limited rights given to them in terms of supplies of firewood, thatching grass, and fodder grass. The mention of old village sites is important, as I said, because it also shows you that shifting cultivation had been practiced in Saranda prior to the reservation of 1882. It was estimated that shifting and semi-permanent cultivation had been carried on in the century preceding the report, especially between 1830 and 1882. And the evidence for this was the burial stones, the Sasan stones, which have again come into big news recently because the Adivasis were trying to claim back their lands on the basis of their burial stones. And this resulted in a huge conflict in Jharkand recently, where you get shifting cultivation, which is called by Purunga or Jum. The result was in most cases the production of well-stocked, even-age crops of salt trees. So shifting cultivation necessarily is not bad for the forest. It actually produces a very, very good crop if you return sort of every 15 years to these forests. But as a result of pressure on land, the shifting cultivation period becomes shorter and shorter. So once you get these evictions, as I said, you get the rise of famine. I mentioned the 1897 famine as a tipping point. And by the latter half of the 19th century, you're getting famines hitting India every few years. And in particular, Eastern India, you get the first famine being recorded in the 1890s. Colonial taxation, destruction of the environment had pushed hitherto resilient communities into starvation and famine. So that is the 1897 famine. And you can see the Jesuit priests there, the missionaries were very active in the region. And you can see the start of the famine. So when we come to the third phase of our story then, the second phase, of course, I will skip for reasons of time between 47 and 91, where India pushes through one of the, while it's pushing its developmental agenda, the protection afforded to tribes is still maintained more or less in terms of places like, which are now called Chhattisgarh and in Jharkand today. So there is while in the 60s sees a huge developmental agenda by the state and continued dispossession of groups, there is still on paper protection, which affords some minimum level of protection for these communities. But post-1991, with the heralding of neoliberal laws, there are no sacred frontiers in India today, especially in the context of the way in which mining is taking place. In the morning, we heard about FDI investment in the mining sector, which has been encouraged since 1991. Before that, it was not possible. In 2006, FDI, which was allowed to up to 50%, is now 100%. Since then, hundreds of proposals have been approved by the government in the mining sector. Right now in the Northeast, this is the case. When CSE wrote its report on mining, that's the Center for the Science and Environment, the state was envisaging an investment of about 4,044 crores, and I had okayed 73 proposals from big mining companies, Rio Tinto, De Beers, BHP, Indian companies included Tata and Vedanta. What this means for Saranda today is crisscrossed with mining leases as part of the Saranda developmental plan. The two perennial rivers, the Karo and the Koina, which have supported huge amounts of flora and fauna, are red with iron ore mining. And these 860 square kilometers of forest, which when I went in 2005, was part of a bid for a World Heritage status as an elephant reserve. Unfortunately for them, it coincided with the same time as India has launched its war on minerals in Chhattisgarh in 2005 and opened up its borders. So that was the end of the elephant reserve plan. Today, the elephants sort of roam in and out of Saranda with no real elephant corridor. The damage done to elephants by mining tailings is remarkable. India's elephants are under severe threat. So the Saranda then later becomes a stronghold for Maoists. Operation Green Hunt is launched in 2011. The areas which I traveled in Saranda, which was still beautiful in 2005, the rest house I stayed in had been burned by the state in its conflict with the Maoists in that period. So the story of Saranda in 2015 is brilliantly told by Gladson Dungdun in his Mission Saranda, where he talks about human rights violations, extrajudicial killings, and the current nature of the conflict in the region, which is, closed off to not just indigenous communities, but to tourism, to everything, to all travel, as the conflict raged, the last frontier, in terms of India's war on its resource war that it's conducting in the last bits of the frontier. It's interesting that there's no mapping of sacred groves in India, and this map which has been generated just misses hundreds of sacred groves. It just mentions a few. So there's still a huge mapping exercise to be done in terms of the distribution of sacred groves in India. So to conclude then, horrible death from hunger prevails. Oh, for the days when men knew no cares, but drank their fill of home-brew ale. Woe to this day when men on earth below do daily die of famine. So Munda's song in the 1900s is become even more common today. So what is this? What have I tried to do here? So I've talked a little bit about the way in which the land management policies of the British did protect the forest, but it was a form of fortress conservation with little regard to the forest dwelling communities. On the other hand, very little of India's forests would have survived into the 20th century if it had not been for some form of preservation. But post-1991, neoliberal enclosures are, as we have seen, are at an all-time high. And this is particularly true in the context of extractive industries and the way in which India has opened its borders, even in these so-called sacred frontiers to mining. The state is increasingly resorting to violence. So the links between the state and corporate companies are something we really need to understand, and the way in which this violence is spiraling out of control and the extrajudicial killings are something that we as civil society organizations and civil society members need to be aware of and campaign for. And Zuky's call that we all join this meeting, which is happening immediately after this, to see how internationally we can do this, is I think quite important. But within this, the hope is the continuous Adivasi protest. I showed you Gladson Dungdung sort of. He's a leading activist who's currently traveling around the region, documenting. What he's doing is documenting the atrocities, documenting the violations, documenting. India still is ostensibly a democracy with a rule of law, so challenging this. And in the Northeast, we heard Jita Neumnam's amazing sort of hopeful narrative of how protest matters, how resistance is important. And the continuation of this is, I think, very, very valid for us today. And the overall debate on the Anthropocene, or what some would prefer, Capitalocene. So this is the last frontier for us. And if we are not there at the barricades, then this last frontier will fall. And I'll stop there.